The United States. 50 states, 2 oceans, and fixed borders. But what if that's not strictly true? What if the borders aren't actually finished? Maybe one of the next places Washington wants isn't even American yet. Why does the US already treat Greenland like it owns it? And let's face it, after Venezuela, anything is possible. Take a look at the North Atlantic island. Lightly populated, resource-rich, and quickly becoming central to US missile defense and Arctic strategy. This makes Greenland a modern test case for how America expands, without officially expanding. Greenland is 3 times the size of Texas and has fewer people than a small US town. And it sits directly under the shortest missile path between Russia and America. As of January 2026, it's still a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It's had self-rule since 2009, though Denmark handles foreign affairs and defense. In reality, Greenland hosts Pituffik Space Base, the northernmost US military base. For decades, Pituffik has worked as a giant ear, listening for ballistic missiles passing over the pole and keeping a close eye on the Russian Northern Fleet. One reason Pituffik matters so much is that the Arctic isn't as far away as it used to be. In a missile age, distance matters less. The shortest route between Russia and North America isn't across an ocean, it's over the pole. That's why Greenland has always been valuable, even when it looked like nothing but ice and rock. And it's why the base isn't just a leftover Cold War relic. It's one of the few places where radar coverage, satellite tracking, and early warning infrastructure really count. The US doesn't have to own Greenland to use that advantage, but it does have to make sure access can't be disrupted. And that's where the conversation stops being about diplomacy and starts being about permanence. But in the last few years, America has been focused on something else. Climate change is melting the ice, up to 280 billion tons per year in some periods, and as it pulls back, it's exposing something that used to be impossible: shorter shipping routes like the Northwest Passage. If the Arctic becomes passable, the first country to control it won't just move ships faster, it'll decide who gets delayed, who pays more, and who gets cut out entirely. And once a route becomes real, the world starts rebuilding around it. Ports expand, insurance markets adjust, shipping companies plan whole futures around the new timeline. And that changes what control looks like. It's no longer just defending a base. It's managing traffic, enforcing rules, and deciding who gets reliable access. And if this sounds theoretical, it's not. Whoever controls this route doesn't just move ships on a map. They decide who gets rich first. And that's not all either. Greenland isn't valuable because it's big. It's valuable because it contains the kind of minerals the modern US military can't function without. Estimates suggest Greenland holds around 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth elements, the materials that go inside fighter jets, precision-guided weapons, radar systems, and satellites. And that's the problem. If access to rare earths gets restricted, it doesn't just slow down consumer tech, it hits defense production, energy systems, and industrial capacity, the things a country needs in a long crisis. That's why Greenland isn't being treated like a distant territory, it's being treated like a 21st century Louisiana purchase. It's not about influence, but about deciding who can build, who can arm, and who can last. Greenland's politics make things even more complicated. Denmark isn't the only voice involved here. Greenland has its own government, its own parties, and its own internal debate about its future. Some people want more independence. Some want stability and protection through Denmark. Some want the economic upside of development, but fear what happens when the country becomes reliant on foreign money. That's why this isn't just a question of whether Denmark would ever agree, it's whether Greenland can keep saying no once the strategic logic starts tightening. Because the modern takeover doesn't begin with troops, it begins with contracts, infrastructure, and dependency, until one day, the most important decisions aren't being made locally anymore. That's the quiet form of expansion. The paperwork stays the same, but the reality changes underneath it. The move for Greenland isn't just a real estate deal, it's seen as a must-have for survival. The message to Copenhagen is clear. They have something America wants. It's the same thinking that fueled the Louisiana Purchase, just with more satellites and freezing temperatures. The reaction has been immediate. Denmark has called it a major breach of trust, and European leaders are reassessing what this means for NATO's unity. But in Washington, the calculation is simple. The strategic value is too high. and the cost of stopping it is even higher. Would the US suddenly be willing to risk its friendship with NATO for a remote island in the Arctic Circle? And how did things get to this point? To understand why, you have to look at the speed of American growth. America didn't expand because it knew what it was buying. It expanded because it was afraid of who might buy it first. In the early years, the US wasn't a superpower. It was a thin strip of territory on the Atlantic, and the people running it believed something rather simple. If you leave space empty, someone else fills it, usually a rival empire. That's why the US bought Louisiana in 1803 and Alaska in 1867. Something that looked useless on paper became priceless in function. Resources, position, a defensive line facing the ocean. And this is the part most people miss when they talk about American expansion. It rarely starts as conquest. It starts as security. First comes the justification, then access, then permanent infrastructure, then normalization. Only later does the legal status catch up, sometimes decades later. The country expands in function first, and the paperwork comes second. Which is why a place like Greenland wouldn't have to begin with a dramatic annexation. It would begin with reasonable steps, more access, more investment, and more security cooperation. And once that becomes normal, the last step doesn't feel like an invasion anymore. It feels like a formality. And that's the danger. The map doesn't change all at once, it changes quietly. In the 1800s, the US used the Monroe Doctrine to warn Europe to keep out. In 2026, the modern version doesn't always need declarations. It uses money, military access, and pressure to keep rivals from gaining ground. Because if the US doesn't expand its control, someone else will. But there's a problem. Every time the US grows, it faces a choice. Do you bring the people in, like they did with the 50 states? Or do you treat them like the self-governing Puerto Rico or Guam? For the planners in the military, the Caribbean is the gateway to the Western Hemisphere. And if you look at a map of who actually holds the keys, the Arctic looks like a logical next step, rather than a total surprise. In a strange twist of fate, it seems like whenever the US wants to expand its sea border, it usually ends up writing a check to Denmark. Before the 2026 push for Greenland, there was the 1917 purchase of the US Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, totaling about 133 square miles. At the time, the US didn't want the islands because it needed more beaches. It wanted them because World War I was happening, and Germany was looking at the Caribbean as a place to park U-boats. The US offered Denmark $25 million in gold, equivalent to over $700 million today, for the 3 islands. You don't take over a place because you want to manage its schools or pave its roads. You take it over so that no one else can. But if the US is so good at taking land, why stop at 50 states? By the mid-20th century, Washington realized that hard borders were expensive. So, the US mastered the invisible border. It's control without responsibility, using the dollar, the military, and security to manage places like Puerto Rico and the Caribbean without ever adding a star to the flag. Take Puerto Rico, for example. It pays taxes, uses the dollar, sends soldiers to war, and still can't vote for the president who commands them. This is the perfect way to expand. You get the safety and land you need. You get key locations for naval bases. And you get the trade. But more importantly, you don't have to deal with the messy democracy part. And this is the way the US is looking at the future. Whether it's the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos, or even parts of Hispaniola. The US doesn't need to plant a flag to take over. It just needs to make sure that these places stay within the orbit of Washington. Go further back, and you see what the Navy calls sea narrow spots. The Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti, about 50 miles wide at its narrowest. The Mona Passage between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, about 60 miles wide. And if the US controls these, it controls the main pathway of the Western Hemisphere. Every barrel of oil coming out of the Gulf of America, formerly the Gulf of Mexico. Cargo ships coming from Europe and feeding into the Americas. A huge amount of it has to pass through these same corridors. And once you see that, you understand why the Caribbean has always been treated differently. This isn't influence, it's logistics control. Whoever dominates these passages can decide what moves freely and what gets delayed, inspected, rerouted, or priced out. That affects energy, trade and military movement. It shapes how fast reinforcements shift oceans, how quickly ships can respond to a crisis near Central America or the top edge of South America. So the Caribbean isn't just where the US projects power, it's where it controls the rules of movement. And in the modern world, it even affects pressure further away. Because global trade doesn't just depend on oceans, it depends on predictable bottlenecks. When one bottleneck breaks, everything downstream becomes more expensive. That's why the Caribbean is about controlling the lanes that connect the American economy to the rest of the world. The US has spent 200 years trying to make sure the Caribbean is a closed sea. But today, the tools of that control are changing. It's no longer just about sending Marines for short-term occupation like Haiti from 1915 to 1934. Now it's about systems, airspace, shipping lanes, Coast Guard patrols, customs agreements, financial networks. The Caribbean runs through American infrastructure whether the flags change or not. And that's where the invisible border becomes real. Because when a Caribbean government starts to wobble, it doesn't just create local chaos, it hits American leverage immediately. It needs cash, fuel, food, and legitimacy fast. And most of that runs through systems the US controls or dominates. And you can see it in real life. A hurricane wipes out ports and power, and suddenly the country isn't just rebuilding, it's scrambling for diesel, emergency financing, and US-led disaster relief to keep running. A debt crisis hits, imports stall, and now the government is negotiating austerity and access under outside pressure. Say a political breakdown turns violent. Washington doesn't have to invade. It can freeze aid, shape security support, and tilt the outcome from a distance. That's the modern empire model. No occupation required. The US can steer outcomes while the region stays independent on paper. And that's why the Caribbean isn't just nearby. It's structural. Instability here doesn't stay contained. It raises shipping costs, spikes border pressure, and threatens military readiness across the region. And that's the point. The US doesn't have to take the Caribbean. It just has to keep it running on American terms. The Caribbean is where the US controls access to the Hemisphere. But there's one place that connects the Hemisphere to the entire planet's shipping system. One location that doesn't just matter to Washington. It matters to every major economy on Earth, Panama. In 1903, it was still a part of Colombia. The US wanted a canal. Colombia said no, so Washington sent a Navy ship back to revolt, and a new country appeared almost overnight. The price of that freedom? A 10-mile-wide strip of land the US controlled as if it were independent until 1999. So why does this matter now? Even though the US handed the canal back to Panama, the hunger for it never went away. Recently, there's been an increase in the way people talk about resecuring the canal. Why? Well, because about 5 to 6% of all global sea trade moves through these locks, including 40% of US container traffic. As China continues to invest in other countries via its Belt and Road Initiative, the US is cautiously looking at Panama. It sees a potential weak spot. It doesn't need to invade Panama, it just needs to make it clear that if the canal's neutrality is ever threatened, or if the fees get too high for American tankers, the US military has a leftover right to step in. It's expansion through the fine print. But there is one place that doesn't fit into this thinking: Venezuela. No country in the region combines proximity, energy, value, and political instability the way it does. It's not just a foreign policy issue, it's a strategic problem sitting next to the US sphere of control. Why does Venezuela keep popping up in every US plan? To answer that, we have to look at why the US sometimes stops just short of taking over a country, and why, in the case of Venezuela, the rules of the map might be about to change entirely. In early January of 2026, the US launched Operation Absolute Resolve, with the aim of capturing Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. And it succeeded, shattering the regime's chain of command, all without formally annexing anything. But notice what happened next. Within 72 hours of the attack, the U.S. Department of Energy announced U.S. oil companies would fix Venezuela's crumbling oil infrastructure. The White House said that between 30 and 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil would now be handled by U.S. accounts. That means controlling the world's largest oil supplies, 303 billion barrels of heavy crude that the U.S. Gulf Coast oil factories were literally built to process. This is where modern expansion stops looking like a conquest and starts looking more like accounting. And by the way, this doesn't mean Venezuela suddenly becomes stable. It just means Venezuela becomes manageable. And those are two very different things. Because once a regime collapses, the next fight isn't theoretical, it's practical. Who controls infrastructure? Who controls exports? Who controls security? And who gets paid? Oil production doesn't come back because Washington wants it to. It comes back when pipelines get repaired, refineries function, workers show up, and the people with guns stop interfering. That's why this kind of operation becomes a long-term management project, even if the US never admits it's doing one. And it's also why Venezuela isn't in the same category as Greenland. Venezuela is about extracting output without inheriting a country. Greenland is about geography that can't be outsourced. Once you understand that difference, the broader pattern becomes clearer. The US takes territory when it needs a permanent position. It takes control when it only needs the resource. That's what makes this story feel bigger than a single crisis. So, why does this keep happening? Well, when a country has exactly what a superpower needs, the relationship stops being optional. Over time, strategy pulls them into the same orbit. With China trying to build ports in the Caribbean and Russia putting advisors in Caracas, Washington's thinking changed. The cost of high energy prices and China's influence in the region meant only one thing. If the US doesn't make their presence felt, someone else will. The US has grown from 13 colonies to a huge country. Today, it's attempting to turn the Caribbean into a private lake and Venezuela into a managed oil field. And now, we're watching it look at the Arctic as its next state. If the US is willing to redraw the map in the north and the south, where does it stop? There are other gaps on the map. Other places where US interests and foreign borders are currently rubbing against each other. Is it the border to the north? The one to the south? Or is the US looking even further afield? Islands in the Pacific that are being built up by rivals. Out here, the US doesn't need to conquer islands, because in the Pacific, control doesn't look like a flag on a beach. Instead, it's paperwork that says everyone else is banned. A runway only one country can use, a radar site watching the horizon, and an agreement that lets Washington decide who's allowed to bring forces into the region. Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, 3 sovereign nations that have become strategic anchors denying China footholds in the island chain that stretches from Hawaii to the Philippines. In 2023, the US claimed an extended ocean floor, adding roughly 386,000 square miles, an area twice the size of California, across the Arctic, Bering Sea, and Pacific. This grants sovereign rights to seabed minerals like cobalt and nickel, critical for the next century of technology. No population or flags needed, just some lines on a map. Even Canada is seen as a target. It has the water, timber, and minerals the next century will run on, and its defense is already deeply tied to the United States. So, when global shortages tighten, the idea of a North American Union stops sounding like a joke and starts sounding like a contingency plan. It wouldn't look like an invasion, it would look like a treaty expansion. By now, the pattern should be clear. The United States doesn't just grow because it's greedy. It grows because it's the world's sole superpower. But this brings us to the big question that keeps experts awake at night. What actually stops the US from just taking over the whole half of the world? It has the military, it has the global currency. Why hasn't the map already turned solid blue from the North Pole to the bottom of South America? The answer comes down to cost. Every time you add a star to the flag, you're not just adding land, you're adding a permanent bill, infrastructure, security, social systems, and millions of new voters who may not agree with you. The US learned this after the 1800s. Taking territory is expensive. Holding it is worse. And today, the punishment doesn't stop at protests or resistance. It hits finances. Because the US isn't invincible. It's swimming in debt, dependent on markets and confidence to keep the system running. And the countries it would provoke by taking land? Many of them hold US Treasury bonds, enough to hurt America if retaliation turns economic. And that's what people forget when they talk about expansion like it's still the 19th century. Every move has consequences that travel through alliances, currencies, and markets. So modern power looks different. Why take land when you can just control access? Why occupy a country when you can just control its money, its roots, and systems? That's the truth about the size of the United States. People focus on borders, but the US is already as large as it can afford to be, just not on the map you're used to seeing. But the real question is whether anyone can really escape America's grip once it takes hold. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MapPack.